Brilliant. Well, thanks for inviting me along today to talk to you. My name's Sian Knight. I'm a lead user researcher at the Department for Work and Pensions. I've been here for just over 3 years now, and before that, I've spent about 20 years working in various kind of research environments, both in private, public sector. So I've done quite a lot of research sessions and interviews in my time, and come across quite a lot of different and challenging situations, shall we say. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm here to kind of talk about some of the issues around research ethics and safeguarding. This was originally a kind of deck that was put together for our user researchers, but actually everything that's covered is relevant to anyone who might be involved in or listening to research sessions. So I think it's kind of something hopefully that you'll find kind of interesting and relevant in your role if you're getting involved in user research. Excuse me. So what I'll do is I'll talk about some of the principles of research ethics, some of the considerations for participant safety and wellbeing, but mainly what I'll try and focus on is researcher and also obviously as part of that observer safety and care as well, because I think that's something we don't really talk about as much as we perhaps should. And then finally, something that you hopefully would be kind of aware of if you've been involved in research sessions, but I'll touch on some of the obligations for observers as well who are taking part in research. So in terms of what I'll kind of cover today in content, there may be some things I touch upon in terms of kind of wider topics that I might talk about. I won't go into detail about anything. I'll just kind of talk about some kind of examples of where things might crop up that might be kind of difficult and challenging things to hear, and maybe some examples in the context of setting up and conducting research. So I won't go into anything kind of in too much detail, but just to kind of warn you that I'll be kind of touching on particular topics. Also, I won't cover the governance and legal side of things, as that's something mainly for your kind of researchers really. But I'm sure you are probably aware of the kind of many legal and ethical obligations that we do have as researchers, and also, you know, as observers if you're involved in some of the research sessions. So what is ethics? What's research ethics? What's it all about? There is lots and lots and lots of work and research that goes on around this topic, and you could probably read about it for months and months and years. But ultimately, the principles of research boil down to two things. Doing good and doing no harm, which is actually a concept that dates back to Aristotle. So, you know, these kind of things have been talked about and discussed for, you know, centuries. The field of research ethics itself is active, constantly developing, lots of kind of new and emerging guidance and that sort of thing. Within user research, we don't have a governing body as such, so we draw a lot of our ethics practices from other research disciplines, largely social research. So, for example, within DWP, we have lots of well-established processes that govern and guide us on ethics. And there's also lots of external sources, such as from the Market Research Society, Social Research Association. They've also got lots of kind of useful guidance as well, if it is something you're interested in finding out more about. So research ethics, it covers a multitude of things, from the legalities of how we kind of collect and handle personal data through to how we look after ourselves and our participants in research sessions. I will touch a little bit, as I say, on the risk of harm to participants, but the main focus will be more on ourselves as researchers and anyone else who might be observing and taking part in research. So here's some of the overarching principles. As I mentioned, do good and do no harm. Secondly, really important that when we're doing research, we're obtaining informed consent. So people are agreeing to take part in research, but that they understand what it is they're kind of agreeing to take part in. We have a responsibility to minimise the risk of harm to our participants. We must protect anonymity and confidentiality, avoid using deceptive practices, and also make sure participants are aware they have the right to withdraw from research at any time. So they may have given their informed consent at the start of the research, but they have the right to withdraw from that research either during a research session or after a session if their information hasn't been anonymised or analysed at that point. So, as I say, the kind of one of the principles is around participant safety and well-being. So as I say, this was kind of created for some of our researchers at DWP. So here at DWP, we do a lot of research with people who are potentially very, very vulnerable. We interact with people at very difficult times in their lives, for example, maybe going through bereavement, ill health, terminal illness, debt, redundancy. So, for example, in bereavement, we have researchers who've been working on projects around a new way to apply for support payments. So, researchers talking to users who've been recently bereaved about their experience of applying for a support payment. Within health, there's work that's been going on for quite a long time actually, and still carries on around the kind of revision of forms for how people apply for benefits when they've been given less than 6 months to live. So again, researchers not necessarily talking to those people, but talking with people who work with those people, such as Macmillan nurses and GPs, etc. But a lot of that research, when it was pre sort of pandemic, took place in hospices and that sort of thing, in those kind of environments. So having said all that, even though as I say, it's more perhaps more likely than in some places we're talking to people at difficult times in their lives, there could be other research sessions where these issues might arise without warning. So it's always a really good idea to kind of think about these things that might crop up, and think about preparing yourself, I guess. So we did have someone from Citizen Advice who came to talk to our user research community last year at one of our community days, and she spoke about the perfect storm on the back of COVID. So in terms of kind of cost of living, the removal of the universal credit uplift, national insurance increase, rising energy prices, and that was all before the additional rises we've kind of seen in energy prices, cost of living, and the impact of the war at the moment. So it is increasingly likely that if you're involved in research sessions with members of the public, regardless of the topic or what kind of things you're talking about, it's possible that some of these issues might start to arise. So it's just kind of giving you some pointers to think about how you might prepare for this. So these are some of the points of consideration that we ask our researchers to think about and take into account. But again, I will go through them for you as well, because it gives you an idea of the thought process that your researchers will be going through, but also things for you to think about as well when you're kind of involved in maybe the kind of either in the research sessions themselves or in advance or afterwards with the analysis. So the main thing to say is that there's not, when it comes to research, especially kind of qualitative research, there really are no hard and fast rules. We need to think about each project and design the best approach depending on the kind of research questions, the kind of research plan, what it is we're trying to get out of the research itself. But the first thing is thinking about some of the timescales and how and when to make that initial approach. So, for example, with the bereavement work, it was thinking about what's an appropriate period of time to wait until people have kind of made that application for the support payment, so that it's not so the experience is not too raw, but also not waiting so long that they'd forget, so that the research wouldn't be useful. As again, I'm sure as I've mentioned, I'm sure you're aware, it's people have to opt in and give their informed consent to take part in research. But when we're doing kind of research with more vulnerable groups, it's really important that we make this much more clear and ensure people don't feel any obligation to take part. So for the bereavement example, the team wrote letters, very carefully worded letters, made it clear there was no pressure to take part in the research. It sometimes comes up as well where, because obviously as DWP, we're responsible for kind of making benefit sort of payments, it has to be really clear that there's no obligation for people to take part in research. It has no impact at all on their kind of benefit payments. Thirdly, we suggest that researchers be mindful of the individual circumstances and the context, because that will be different for everybody depending on the research. So again, with sort of following through with the example from bereavement, we shouldn't assume that people don't want to take part. With that example, we don't know there's obviously different circumstances and a different role that people has to play in that process. And for those who did agree to take part, they were able to talk about and share some really useful sort of share their experiences, and the team got some really useful insights from them. I think, again, more with kind of vulnerable groups and some of the research we're doing, it's more important that we let people talk and facilitate more of a conversation rather than sticking strictly to a script. So it might be sometimes in research sessions, researchers may sort of bring people back to a topic rather than letting them talk. But in these interviews, it's kind of perhaps more important to let people talk. Having said that, we're not counsellors, so we have to kind of be mindful, and I'll kind of come back to this kind of point later. But we need to show empathy, and as such, you might want to sort of consider scheduling longer interview times to allow for that conversation to evolve. Again, the consent thing, as kind of can't reiterate this enough, but it's also throughout the interview. It's really important that people are reminded they can stop at any time, or especially if you think someone's getting upset. This is even more important when we've been doing research remotely, because you kind of don't have those same kind of cues as you perhaps would have if you're in a room with somebody. Ideally, you might want to think about recording interviews if you're able to, because it takes out that need for, if you're doing an interview and trying to take notes on pen and paper, there's a potential you're looking at your pen and paper and not engaging with the person that you're talking to. Again, it could be recording or ideally having someone in the room taking notes. Obviously, this was kind of, again, a bit more designed when we were doing face-to-face research more as the norm, I guess. But obviously, we will start to be returning to more face-to-face research as kind of restrictions have lifted. It's the kind of next point is around being aware of your demeanor and your behavior when you're kind of conducting interviews. So things around kind of how you may approach a building, for example. So we've had researchers doing work in hospices or homeless centres, so it's just being aware of how you're acting. I mean, it sounds like common sense really, and it is actually, but I think it's just important things to just think about in advance. And then finally, thinking about the kind of venues and locations for where you might be conducting research or taking or doing kind of interviews. So for some, that might be in people's homes, probably perhaps less so now. But again, if that's the case, you need to think about some of the additional risks and considerations to take into account. Or it may be that other venues, a sort of more neutral venues where people may feel more comfortable. So this certainly doesn't cover everything that kind of researchers might need to think about, or that you need to think about in our research. And it's kind of they're all things that we should be thinking about with all research, not just with people who are kind of a bit more vulnerable. But it's just some of those factors we need to think about when we're protecting our participants. So I will move on to talk a little bit more now about sort of researcher and observer safety and care. So as I mentioned, obviously, as well as this responsibility that we have to participants, we also have a responsibility to ourselves and our colleagues to be mindful of our own safety and care. At DWP, all of our researchers do keeping safe training before they conduct any face-to-face research. Again, I'm not sure, I know we've got a mix of kind of people on the call here, so I'm not sure if it's something that you have within your own organisations, but it might be something that's kind of worth exploring to see if anything similar exists. So just going to talk a little bit now about vicarious trauma. So this is trauma that's caused by exposure to other people's trauma, or hearing about other people talking about their traumatic experiences. So researchers and obviously anyone, observers, note takers who are kind of taking part in these research sessions, spend a lot of time listening to other people's stories. Researchers tend to be highly empathetic people, so that what that means is some people have a tendency to kind of absorb some of these sort of experiences as well, and this can kind of lead to trauma, which may manifest its kind of self in different ways for different people. So this is a summary of some work that's been done, extensive research that was done by Oxford University. So to the bottom here, we've got some of the symptoms of secondary trauma. So again, as I say, these are things that can manifest themselves in different ways for different people. So for some it might be physical, for some it might be more the feelings of guilt or shame, or difficulty managing emotions. So again, what would encourage is you kind of think about what ways trauma or stress might manifest itself, and kind of being aware of that yourself, and maybe within with your colleagues and sort of team members as well. And then to the top, some of the kind of things that you might want to think about to help you in kind of addressing some of these issues that might kind of crop up. So I think the one thing to always remember is when you're involved in research, and I think it's really important to kind of to reiterate this is that, our intentions are good when we're doing research, and we're doing this research for a reason, and that reason is usually to make things better for people and for the people that we're talking to. So that's a kind of really important thing to kind of remind ourselves. But also in terms of other ways of how we kind of support each other, and different things work for different people. And again, it's kind of thinking about what works for you. Some people like to talk about things, people like to write things down, some people might like to go and sort of exercise, go for a run. So it's just thinking about what works for you, and having that support network in place if you need it, if you're going to be taking part in kind of research sessions. So again, within DWP and within the civil service, permanent staff have access to various resources through PAM Assist. So again, there's kind of all sorts of things that people can get access to. So again, it might be something you can explore within your own organisations if you think it's relevant and appropriate. So just following on from this, we're just going to talk a little bit about I guess some of the practicalities and how people can help to prepare to deal with difficult situations that might arise in research sessions. So as I say, quite a lot of this was devised for researchers, but they're all things that are kind of appropriate as well for anyone who's kind of involved in these sessions. So ideally, your researchers should be doing a briefing session before you're taking part in any observations or note taking, especially if it's kind of about things that might be maybe more sensitive, or things might arise. But as I say, sometimes things might arise that you weren't expecting if you're kind of doing a research about one topic, and you never quite know where the conversation is going to go. So within DWP, we've been developing some guidance around this briefings to make sure we've got consistency. The first thing, so that again, I would say is familiarise yourself with any ethics guidance that does exist within your organisation, any sort of steps or processes that you need to be aware of and need to follow should anything kind of difficult crop up in any research sessions. So again, for example, within DWP, we have a 6-point plan, which is for everybody within DWP who has contact with the public, and if someone harms themselves or threatens to harm themselves, there's kind of a clear steps that we all need to follow. So again, it's kind of do you have anything within your organisation that would support you if something like that was to happen? The second thing is to kind of prepare and think about how you might respond in different situations. So if something does come up that's unexpected, you'll be better prepared to respond. And again, that's something we try and encourage our researchers to do. We did have a kind of session at one of our community days last year where we kind of came up with different scenarios. They were all kind of scenarios that had actually happened for people in research sessions, and we got people to kind of discuss and talk about how they might respond in that situation, what additional support they would have liked to see in place to support them if something like that had happened. And as I say, we're seeing kind of several examples of things that kind of crop up that people perhaps weren't quite prepared for. I mean, obviously you can't prepare for every scenario, but you can think of some of the things that might come up, such as, particularly challenging participant, someone who maybe goes off topic repeatedly, or someone who's aggressive. So again, it's just, thinking about those things in advance with your researcher and talking about how you might respond. The third thing is to speak up at the outset if you don't feel comfortable about taking part or being involved in particular research, if it's around a particular topic that you feel might be difficult to hear about, then you should be able to say that that you don't feel comfortable taking part. And again, that's something we suggest, that if it's a particular problem within the team, we advise our researchers to talk to kind of seniors or leads who might be able to support them on that one. And having said that, as I say, sometimes things can crop up in interviews that we're not quite expecting. So the other thing that we say to research is that it's okay to exit an interview if you feel uncomfortable, and in fact you should do that. So I think again, in terms of your role as observers and note takers, it's something that you have a discussion about in advance. And it may be that there's a safe word you use, or some kind of signal that if you don't feel comfortable carrying on because something's come up within the interview, it's kind of, how do you kind of communicate that to the researchers so that they can finish the wrap up the interview early if necessary. So the researcher doesn't have to indicate that they're finishing early. They would find a natural break where they can bring things to a conclusion. But again, if this is something you thought about and discussed in advance, it's if it needs to happen, then it's kind of easier to deal with. And at the end of the day, it's just a one research session. It's more important that you're looking out for your health and the health of those around you. And as I say, yeah, we kind of advise researchers to be briefing their note takers and observers as well. As I kind of mentioned, really, some of these things I mentioned. So identify what works for you in terms of recognizing the signs of trauma and how you deal with it. So as I say, everyone's different. Certainly, again, within DWP, we have mental health first aiders, and I know a lot of organisations have them available as well to talk to, and kind of other resources and other people you can talk to and get help about. This point's a little bit more for the researchers, but again, we advise them that to be careful not to get drawn into other things as well, that they're there to do a role as a researcher, and sometimes they need to remind participants of that. So for example, people sometimes get asked to help with filling in application forms, or or helping with other things that are kind of outside the remit really of the research. And I think it's important that the researchers remind people of their role, maybe point people to where they might be able to get help, and also remember that even though we want to help people, there's a risk we might do the wrong thing or give them the wrong information, and that's not good for anybody. If appropriate, your researcher might have a list of resources to signpost people to, particularly if you're talking about a difficult topic or something in particular. So again, that's something we've kind of been developing an information sheet, and we've also had a bit of a discussion about whether it's something we probably would send out in advance. So it's kind of there for everybody and available for everybody, because we've had sort of situations where we've sent things in response to something arising out of a research session, which has then led to kind of annoyance in those situations, but can lead to further distress or annoyance. So if you're kind of getting those things out there, you can kind of point to them if something crops up within a research session. And again, just a final few points. I think I've kind of probably mentioned most of these already. So thinking about any relevant training that you can access within your organisations or more widely, being aware of some of the kind of potential background triggers or things that you might find difficult to hear about. It's really important that you're working in teams. So working with your researchers, working with your other observers, your colleagues, to support each other. Make sure you're having regular debriefs, and kind of you've got the appropriate support, and don't be afraid to ask for help and offer help as well to your colleagues. So I'm just coming, this is the final section now, so and then I'll finish and open for questions. But so again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, as observers or note takers, you also have certain obligations when you're taking part in research sessions. These should be things that your researcher is sharing with you anyway. And some of these are kind of probably more appropriate for face-to-face, but again, it's just important things for you to be thinking about as and when you're involved in research. So observers, they're defined as anyone who views or listens to participants, so that could be either live or recording. Obviously, a lot of these points kind of relate to physically being kind of part of the research, but some of them do apply as well if you're or watching recordings of people. So observers may be visible or not visible. So it may be that you're watching using a research lab, for example. So you're watching on screens or through a glass or that sort of thing. Um, you should fit into the background. Your researchers should be telling the participants of the role of the observer, and also, who is observing as well. So, if the participants know the observers, they should be given the opportunity to withdraw, or the observers asked to leave the session. Researchers should be ensuring that personal details are not shared while there are observers taking part, or kind of there in the sessions. And observers should also make sure that participants are treated with respect. So if you are watching recordings or in another kind of room, not physically in the room with people, it's being aware of not saying anything that you wouldn't say to someone if they were in the room, for example. In terms of what to do as an observer, it's kind of important you kind of sit out of the way in terms of the research session. But if you are there to kind of observe and take notes, obviously it's sitting in such as ways that you can still observe what's going on without kind of interfering with what's going on. The researcher should be introducing you and the research, and as an observer, it's important that you kind of let the researcher lead the session and refrain from answering or asking questions throughout or making comments, even though sometimes it might be quite tempting to want to do so. Write down any observations that you might have, but also equally watching is really important as well. So it's kind of refining your note taking technique potentially as well, to make sure you're not spending all of your time writing down notes and not kind of observing what's going on. And again, something probably to agree in advance. If you have any questions or comments, write them down, and then the researcher would potentially invite you to ask them at the end. So as I say, hopefully a lot of these things are not unfamiliar to you. So just to kind of sum up really, hopefully I've just given you a useful overview of some of the things that you need to think about potentially when you're involved in any research sessions. I hope one thing I will say, I hope I haven't put any of you off from note taking and observing. And I would say, it is incredibly rare that major issues kind of arise during sessions. But just by the very nature of the people that we research with, and as I say, with this kind of the changing kind of landscape in which we're kind of doing research, it's inevitable that some of you will hear some difficult stories and experiences, and as I say, we're kind of worried that these sort of stories might become more prevalent over the coming months as well. So for us, it's really important. It's just about ensuring that you're prepared, even in terms of just thinking about what might happen, and then taking whatever steps you can to protect yourselves and your colleagues, and the participants as well, from the impact of those things.